Yeah, hello. So, shall I start?
Yes, please.
Hello.
Yeah, yes,
Yeah,
please.
yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So, good evening, everyone. So, it's a great privilege and honor for us to have another lecture in the Gender Discourse series. Today's lecture is the 13th webinar on the topic Understanding What, How, and Why for Women's Studies. For this lecture, we have Professor Bharathi Harishankar. It is a privilege to have you, ma'am, on this platform and speak upon the topic. Ma'am is the founding head of the Department of Feminist Studies, University of Madras, and she's also a professor of English. She's also the member of syndicate, which is nominated by the Governor Chancellor. She's also the director of Internal Quality Assurance Cell, University of Madras, and she's also the coordinator of RUSA 2.0 project in humanities and social science. Dr. Bharathi's research interests include post-colonial studies, gender studies, literary theory, translations, web-based pedagogy, and open educational resources. She has 109 publications, including books, edited volumes, textbooks, articles, and translations in national and international journals. She has presented invited talks in over 100 conferences, most notably at Cambridge University, UK, and La Petra Dialogues at University at New York University, Florence. She has successfully guided 14 MPhil and 11 PhD scholars. Recently, Dr. Bharathi was instrumental in setting up a gender lab, the first of its kind in the country. It was to offer online workshops on gender sensitization. She has also designed a soft skill course on gender sensitization and workplace readiness. She has also been awarded with several awards. Some of them are here. M- MHRD's leadership for academician program at Jamia Millia Islamia and University of Virginia, member of the School Board of Humanities at University of Hyderabad, Humanities Research Center Travel Grant Australia, visiting fellowships to the universities in New Zealand, Shastri Indo-Canadian Faculty Enrichment Fellowship, Shastri Indo-Canadian Collaborative Course Development Grant with Dr. Evanil Ellerman, Honorary Adjunct Professorship at Athabasca University, Canada, nominated member of Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, Australia, consultant author for Commonwealth of Learning and UNESCO, member and editorial board of the International Journal Communication and Culture, peer reviewer for the International Journal Sexualities, Pre-Military Panel Advisor for Sahitya Akademi Award in English, member of the CII Southern Regional Committee on Corporate Social Responsibility (CSR), member of CII Southern Regional Committees on Affirmative Action, member of UGC's National Committee for Choice Board Credit System, and member of Selection Committee for India Studies, Chair for Indian Council for Cultural Relations. Dr. Bharati has successfully completed many national and international projects. So these are Principal Project Officer for a project on online tutorial for rural school students at IIT Madras, project leader for a project on open education resources on soft skills funded by International Development Research Center IDRC Canada, principal investigator for a project on the Devdasi system in India funded by National Commission for Women, principal investigator for a project on the impact of corporate social responsibilities activities on the skill building of women in rural Tamil Nadu, and co invigilator for Erasmus and project of European Union on capacity building in higher education. So I extend a very warm welcome to Professor Bharati, and without much delay, I would request to her to proceed with the session.
Good evening
Hello.
to all of you, and thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar series on gender discourse. So the All India Women Studies Students Federation is doing a human service through these webinar series because we are a community of scholars, students doing women's studies, and we need to understand what is happening and how best to take this discipline forward. And thanks also for that very, very generous introduction and to your team out there. Thank you. So the topic for today is understanding the what, how, and why of women's studies. It may seem to many of you that I'm raising a question that probably all of us know. If you think that way, not really. Because anything that is considered an academic discipline, we need to know, understand, and interrogate the nitty-gritties of that particular subject. So in other words, what I am going to do today is to show you the nuts and bolts of the discipline called women's studies. And in order to do that, as much as we would like to just list out a set of points and say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, these are what women's studies mean. Unfortunately, like every discipline, women's studies, and more so, women's studies cannot be just pinned down to a set of points. So right through my talk, you will notice two things. There are times when I'm telling you what women's studies as a discipline means, and there are points where I'm saying what women's studies is not. So it is equally important to understand what comes under the purview of the academic discipline we call women's studies. So women's studies as an academic discipline started in the late 1960s. So for about 80 years, it has been doing the rounds in all over the world, in universities and in colleges and other higher educational centers. But what is interesting is for a very long time, women's studies, more than being considered as an academic discipline, kept getting viewed as, oh, it's a nice idea to study women. So it was an idea. It was a concept. Oh, there are a lot of disparities in the world, a lot of inequalities in the world. So let us study women and by extension, gender. So conceptually, we were looking at women's studies. And then there have been activists, people who have been engaged in the field, and they were dealing with issues which we now discuss in our classrooms day in and day out and for many years. So for them, women's studies means practice. And now, as I mentioned, over the last 80 years, we are looking at it as an academic field and a research discipline. So for any particular topic, any particular field to be recognized as a research area and an academic discipline, we do require quite a few of these common expectations of a discipline. But before that, before I move on to that, what I would like to highlight is very often we believe and assume that women's studies means study of women, study about women, and by extension, gender. So I'm going to come to this a little later, but what I would like you to remember is women are not the objects of study. If we consider women's studies as doing that, I think we are doing a disservice to the discipline. What women's studies is in fact putting the focus on women as the subjects of study. And there's a lot of difference. What we see in the media today, what we see in the perpetration of stereotypes, even in the patterns of violence that we see right across, we are looking at women as objects. Whereas, as an academic discipline, women's studies foregrounds women as the subject of study. So I want you to keep this in mind. The other fascinating aspect of women's studies is that it can actually talk to a lot of disciplines. You name the discipline, it can talk to that discipline. So initially, women's studies anywhere in the world was looked upon as an extension of, say, history, literature, and sociology. But today, we do have women's studies engaging with a whole lot of disciplines, including philosophy, religion, art, anthropology, political science, economics, psychology, and I only named a few. So you can add to that. And the other aspect also is the fact that women's studies has been known by various names. It started out as female studies, and then it was called women's studies. And suddenly we thought, no, it can be more politically right if we call it women and gender studies. And a separate track in all this is feminist studies. So you would notice that women's studies has a trajectory where it's somewhere in the middle, but that term seems to have stuck on. So for female studies, from female studies to women's studies, to women in gender studies, to feminist studies. And I keep wondering, I mean, why couldn't we have just begun the whole thing calling it feminist studies? It is because many of us are still reluctant and we say, I'm a feminist, but I'm a feminist in this way. So in other words, we are busy giving an explanation for the brand of feminism that we adopt and we use. So that is where women's studies as a discipline has been shifting around from calling it female studies to gender to beyond. So having said that, I have basically told you what is or is not women's studies. But one of the things that many of you who are students of women's studies would be asked, because I have been asked for many, many years now, and even when I try to, I'm the founding head of the Department of Women's Studies. So when we tried to start a very young Department of Women's Studies in a very old university of Madras, one of the things that I was asked frequently is, why women's studies? Would you have something called men's studies now? Why should we read them separately? Why should we study them separately? The simple answer is we have probably read all our disciplines from one point of view, which did not include women or which silenced women or which made women invisible. And more the reason to study women's studies. Okay? And as a joke, I would always keep saying, let's come to the minute we say end of patriarchy, then we don't need women's studies. So you would notice that till patriarchy and its extensions, patriarchal institutions persist, we do need women's studies. Of course, gender is an important aspect, but let us not equate women and gender studies as if they are one. So with this, I have touched upon what is or what is not women's studies. And now the second part of my title, how. So many of you may be puzzled saying, how can we ask a question like how of a discipline? An academic discipline has certain practices, has certain criteria to be recognized as an academic discipline. And at a very broad level, we have about 5 different qualities that we expect from an academic discipline. One, that it has a community of scholars. And here again, women's studies is unique because our community of scholars are not only academics. People on the field, people working in NGOs, activists, are social personnel on the field. They have more knowledge of the reality of women's existences in the world. So we need to, when we say a community of scholars, we need to expand. When we ask how do we recognize women's discipline, studies as a discipline, we need to expand this notion of a community of scholars to community of scholars, which include field level workers, activists, NGOs, policymakers, as well as academic scholars. The second quality to be recognized as an academic discipline is that it has a tradition or history of inquiry. And here is where we notice that we have always spoken about women. We have always spoken gender issues in many, many disciplines. So if we look at women's studies as a unitary discipline, we will stumble here. But if, on the other hand, we look at women's studies as a multidisciplinary field with several interdisciplinary possibilities, certainly it is an academic discipline. And here is where you need to look at how women's studies curriculum were developed in the initial stages all over the world. But I'm going to talk only about the Indian context, for instance. If you looked at the 1980s and beyond, many of our MA curriculum included women in literature, women in economics, women in development, women in religion, women in history. And we believed that we did a multidisciplinary focus there. The answer is yes and no. We probably did, but we did not do it with an interdisciplinary focus. So in order to discuss this aspect of the tradition of inquiry that has been there in women's studies, it's probably useful for us to go back to some basic terms and start defining them. One, there are 4 terms that we keep coming across in trying to describe women's studies. Some would say it's multidisciplinary. Some would say it's interdisciplinary. Some would say, no, wait, it may be cross-disciplinary or pluridisciplinary. The simple answer, if you have a question now for me, is it's all of these, depending on which side you look at it from. It's like the Himalayas. Whether you're looking at it from the Nepal side or the Indian view or any other view, you would suddenly get a very, very different picture. So now let's go back to defining these 4 terms. Multidisciplinary basically means combining several disciplines which may or may not result in the impact of one disciplinary focus on another. So as I gave that example, many of our courses kept listing women in each of the disciplines separately. And in this case, what we did was we were trying to provide a multidisciplinary focus on women. It had its advantages, but it also had a disadvantage in that women or the aspect of gender was just to add on. Oh, there is this discipline of economics, we are just adding gender to it or women to it. There is this vast ocean of literature and you're just adding gender to it or women to it. So while it was useful in the initial stages, it was very important for women's studies as a discipline to move beyond. And that is where we started using cross-disciplinary approaches. So what we mean by cross-disciplinary is you use the techniques and tools from one discipline and apply it to another discipline so that you expand the scope of the discipline that you are studying. In our case, women's studies. So when psychoanalytical feminism came in or post-colonial feminist theory came in, what we were doing was there were certain tools in psychoanalysis, there were certain tools in the existing post-colonial thought that we derived and applied. It certainly helped, in a sense that it was doing one of several things. One, it gave us better insights into our own field of study, women's studies. It also did something else. It started telling us what was the limitation of those disciplines. So in literature, when we talk about the representation, we assumed that representation of men and women were similar, identical. So all our theories we were only talking about politics of representation. But till we brought in a conscious women's studies focus, we did not take cognizance of the fact that the politics of representation of a woman in literature and politics of representation of men in literature were two different aspects. And it helped us identify stereotypes in these representations. So here is where a cross-disciplinary approach has been very, very useful for women's studies. However, we also get a lot of criticism for using the cross-disciplinary techniques and tools, because the aspect there is, oh, but you do not understand, the way we look at it in economics is this way, in literature is this way. So the questioning of existing disciplines, in addition, at the same time while we are adopting their techniques and tools, has been an necessary paradox that we have had to encounter in women's studies. We use their tools, but while using their tools, we also realize the limitations and the boundaries of the existing disciplines as far as the focus on women or gender is concerned. And that is where cross-disciplinary approach has actually given us a lot of leverage. And if we can look back at what has helped women's studies to become visible as an academic discipline, I would certainly say a cross-disciplinary, and one more type which will come in a few minutes now. The third aspect of women's studies is the interdisciplinary aspect of it. So what does interdisciplinary focus mean? It means that we recognize the subtleties of every discipline and we create a new body of knowledge which derives, adapts, adopts, resists, changes, and transforms the discipline that we engage ourselves with. So, like cross-disciplinary, women's studies has been engaging with multiple disciplines, deriving the framework, while at the same time questioning the limitations of that framework. So you go back and read your postmodern feminist theories, post-colonial feminist theories, Marxist theory, Marxist feminist theories, socialist feminist theories. Everywhere we have gone back to a theory, we have taken those ideas, we have derived from them, but not passively. When you derive from something passively, we'll say, as so and so states. So our pet friendly enemy is Freud. So we will keep saying, as Freud states in this particular essay, and we quietly adopt and apply it to our reading. No. An interdisciplinary approach requires that we indicate to what extent Freud is useful, to what extent the application of Freudian psychoanalysis questions our own reading, the women's studies grounding, but it also asks whether Freud has made assumptions that we need to question and resist in women's studies. If we do all that, that is where you get into interdisciplinary framework. So over the last 10 years, 5 to 10 years, I find that a lot of MA Women's Studies programs all over India have moved towards having courses which are not in blocks like women and literature, but which can engage in an interdisciplinary manner. So the quick example, you can go back and look at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences website. So they have a course called Ecology, Environment, and Sustainable Development. And within the PG program in Women and Gender Studies. So when we look at this combination, you suddenly realize that ecology as a discipline informs women's studies. That's why we have ecofeminism. But at the same time, there are aspects of ecology which have not been contested at all from a gender lens. Similarly, you notice that environment, I mean, who can forget the Chipko movement? All women making that big dent in the whole view of livelihood for women. So that ground level, grassroots level reality can also be captured. So this particular course puts a very nice combination of things. So when we have that, we are able to negotiate and deal with women's studies in an interdisciplinary fashion. So for instance, at the Department of Women's Studies, University of Madras, we have a course called Life Narratives of Women in Science. And when I put that course forward, people thought it was a strange course to put in. And my point there was, we keep talking about a lack of enough visibility for women in science or the STEM subject. But isn't it important to understand the existing women and what their life narratives tell us about the path ahead or the path they have traversed? Because for women's studies, we need a lot of role models in different fields. So here is where we are able to engage. In this particular course, we engage with literature, women's studies as well as science. So this combination allows us to look at each discipline, the extent to which it can contribute, and the restrictions that are inbuilt in a particular discipline. Sorry, I'm not able to hear. Can I move on? Or is there a query?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, sure. And the final part of what women's studies or how to engage with women's studies is the pluridisciplinary. What we mean by pluridisciplinary is two or more disciplines combine their expertise to address an area of concern. So, for instance, when we look at gender, health, and rights, this combination can provide us more information than any one course on gender alone or health alone or the rights of women alone. So combined together, we are able to move forward and engage with women's studies in a much better fashion. So the how to create, or do we have a history of inquiry in women's studies? Yes, we have had a history of knowledge building and inquiry, and the point is it has happened multidisciplinarily, interdisciplinarily, cross-disciplinarily, and pluridisciplinarily. So there may be a bit of a overlap, gray zone that we have encountered, but that is the way women's studies can be engaged with the how of. And the first two, as I talked about, the academic discipline of women's studies, one, a community of scholars, two, a tradition of the history of inquiry. The third aspect is a well-defined way of how data is collected, data is analyzed and interpreted. And that is why we notice that, as I mentioned a little earlier, feminist research methodology and the research methodology put forward by women's studies helps us to look at women as subjects and not objects of study. They are not a statistic, they are not a data in mere numbers, but there is an experience, there is a location, there is a positioning of those respondents as well. And here is where the feminist research methodology, sometimes we probably look at it in a very, very myopic way, because the one-line sentence I hear very often talking about women's studies methodology is that, oh, but they keep still talking about personal is political, so they bring in all the subjectivity into it. If all of us, I mean, outsiders can think about it that way, but if we thought about women's studies methodology as that way, we are completely wrong. Yes, we talk about the need for the subject position of the researcher, but at the same time, the subject position, the subjectivity are two things that have to be clarified. Subjectivity involves the being aware of one, our position as a researcher, two, the inevitable biases that we may bring in our position as a researcher. So that is where what is important is the self-reflexive objectivity. So as a researcher, if I'm aware of what biases, what privileges I bring into a study and I engage with my research through with a complete awareness, then I'm being self-reflexive. If I'm self-reflexive, that subjectivity is not the opposite of objectivity. It is not subjectivity versus objectivity. It is a heightened self-aware objectivity. And self-aware objectivity can enable us to validate, replicate, be transparent about our research processes. So if one of you are thinking of the question of have we reached there? No, we are still in the process. Still, there are times when we seem to slip into the subjectivity versus objectivity mode, whereas this self-reflexive subjectivity allows you to engage with your own thinking on the project. So that is where women's studies can actually contribute a lot to social sciences, humanities, and all research per se. And how do we collect data? Here is where we need to be aware that unlike other academic disciplines, women's studies has an obligation and a focus on the ground reality. We cannot say, oh, it happens to someone somewhere and I'm studying it. No. We have been saying local realities are very important, but at the same time, the reality contributing to that awareness, understanding of that reality has been the fascinating aspect of women's studies. Unlike any other discipline, women's studies is able to engage with an issue that is happening, that has happened right now, ask the right questions, and put forward a recommendation that will treat women as subjects of study and not as objects of study. And that is why most of your supervisors might have told you, be aware of the ethics when you conduct. Yes, ethics of research is important for any research, but as far as the social sciences domain is concerned, the ethics that women studies scholars need to follow is far more and far rigorous. And with this, we move to the next aspect of how women's studies is an academic discipline. It is the creation of new knowledge, and not only just knowledge per se, but a new knowledge paradigm. What do I mean by this? I find it actually pretty curious that our discipline has been in existence for 80 odd years, but I still get requests from people saying, ma'am, I haven't found a supervisor. Okay, I'm willing to look at women and name any one discipline and say, can I do a PhD in women's studies? The answer is a categorical no. I'm from literature, but as a women's studies scholar, the way I engage with literature is very, very different from the kind of questions I will raise if I were looking at it only as a scholar of literature. So you would notice that whatever disciplines we are engaging with, the minute we put the women's studies focus on that, we need to do one of several things. One, there's a lot of stereotyping, and our favorite and pet punch bag is patriarchy. Not necessarily. If we take the view that patriarchy is one sole cause, all we need to do is to question patriarchy, really. But we've been questioning for more than 100 years now, and nothing has changed. Or if the change is there, it's marginal. In which case, we need to start looking at what are aspects of patriarchy, how to question. The minute we ask how to contest patriarchy, one is we need to be aware of the fact that stereotypes are not used in case of literature, only male writers stereotype women. No. Women writers can equally stereotype women. Every other field, it's true. Second is every discipline has a sense of normalization that happens. So, what we mean by normalization? Take any field, there is a gender role expectation that keeps in. And we look at that gender role expectation as something which is over and above the discipline. So let's take the differential wages aspect in economics. So when we were raising the question, how come men and women are getting different wages for the same job? We were often told, no, it happens mainly in the informal sector. And there it's hard physical labor, and men, even though they work for lesser hours, actually can carry more weight, and so their contribution is more. Fine. But how come we are not questioning why there is differential wages in the IT sector? Do you mean to say that our IT employees are all carrying their computers, heavy laptops and systems and servers on their heads? No. Why is it happening then? Because somewhere along when we talk about these differences in wage or wage gap, we are not bringing into focus that at every step it has to be contested. It cannot be normalized as if it is an acceptable practice. So the new knowledge paradigm that women's studies puts forward is one where stereotypes are contested. Gender role expectations are not allowed to be normalized and homogenized. So in other words, we try and understand how gender interacts and intersects with several sociocultural markers: caste, class, race, religion, urban versus rural. You name, it is there. So gender, the paradigm that we are introducing through women's studies is a new knowledge paradigm where we are looking at the intersectional nature of our lives today and how gender pervades all the other markers. The issue of women pervades all other markers. So if someone asks, how does women's studies contribute to a new knowledge paradigm? Precisely in these steps. And the fifth aspect of what an academic discipline should be is the communication networks that are available. Yes, we have journals, books, popular presentations, media. This happens in all disciplines. This also happens as in women's studies. But where women's studies scholarship leads the way is the fact when we are able to not only talk to other disciplines, we are able to connect with several people who contribute to a better understanding of gender, to better lived reality of gender. And that is why no academic discussion of in women's studies can exclude the points of view, perspectives from our T-level workers, social workers, activists, governmental policies, and of course the non-governmental players. So suddenly this little idea of being a scholar has to be expanded as far as women's studies is concern. So through these 5 aspects of the community of scholars, a tradition of inquiry, a well-defined way of data collection and analysis, well-defined requirements of a new knowledge paradigm, and the existence of a communication network, we engage in women's studies. So that answers the how that I raised. And now the third aspect of my presentation. Why women's studies? Why do we need a separate discipline? The answer is, whatever be our disciplines, the disciplinary boundaries are restrictive. So we need women's studies to extend the disciplinary boundary markers of other disciplines, but we also need women's studies to collapse and dismantle a few of the flawed disciplinary assumptions that we make. And that is where the why of women's studies is so crucial. Similarly, women's studies in its multidisciplinary, the talking to nature, and a network of multiple stakeholders enables us to keep contesting stereotypes as they get formed. Keep questioning homogenizations and normalizations of stereotypes and perpetration of them. So even though we keep raising our queries on, say, a rape victim, still media reports will persist on the dress that the woman wore. So my favorite punchline here is, if dress is the provocative part of a woman's anatomy, then why are children getting raped? Here is where you would notice that over a period of time, we keep hearing it in media, we keep hearing it even sometimes within our classrooms, these normalizations, but we do not contest them. Why don't we contest them? Because contestation of any normalization requires that we understand the difference between perception and perspective. Perception is individual, subjective, but what happens is, anytime we deal with women and gender issues, the perceptions are projected as perspectives. And over a period of time, those perspectives get accepted as norms. And that is why we need women's studies to keep contesting as they emerge. We can't, just sit back and say, oh, they will emerge, they will grow, and they will also collapse. No, nothing collapses on its own volition. We do require people to start asking questions. So if you ask me why women's studies, I will say it helps me to raise a lot of questions. And the mark of good research and a good research scholar or a good student is to ask questions. If we do not ask questions, we are in danger of either accepting what has been presented, projected to us, or we are in danger of just viewing it as someone else's perspective. No. Every perspective has to be understood, contested before it is accepted. And that is where the why of women's studies becomes very crucial. But in order to keep developing our knowledge paradigm, what do we need as a little introspection? I mean, we keep contesting what others do, but what introspection can we provide to ourselves? One is, we keep talking about women's studies as multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. But do we have an interdisciplinary vocabulary? Have we created that? Not yet. I find a few here and there, but we do not get a truly interdisciplinary vocabulary. Any academic discipline which calls itself interdisciplinary has to necessarily have this particular vocabulary which not only encompasses these multiple disciplines, not only talks to these multiple disciplines, but it should also have the vocabulary to question and pinpoint a gap or a lacuna. I do not think we have reached a complete interdisciplinary vocabulary. I'm open for contestation here. The other is, we keep getting into this little confusion time and again. Which aspect do we foreground? Women, gender, or the disciplinary principles? The danger here is, if we accept the principles of a particular discipline, we end up not addressing gender enough. But if we overemphasize gender, we may run into the risk of not keeping to the tenor of that particular discipline. And what do? It's a classic chicken egg problem. Which comes first? Is it gender? Is it the disciplinary principles? If you ask me, I will say, why are we in the binary mode? Haven't we had a lot of binaries thrust upon us for ever so long? So instead of either or, if we are able to say, let us side by side juxtapose the gender aspect with the disciplinary aspect. If we juxtapose, we are able to get better vantage points to view the discipline and to view the issues pertaining to women and gender by extension. So the either or binary in terms of the concern for gender and the concern for the disciplinary principles we need to overcome. So the why women studies can also have a very, very material aspect. If I study MA in women's studies, will I get a job? Yes, you will get a job. I can tell you that. What kind of job? What kind of career do we have? Can we offer our students? The point there is, yes, you can come into academia, and thanks to the women's studies being part of the NET syllabus, we have students clearing their JRFs and NET exam. So they have an opening in academics. NGOs need a lot. I don't know about the other states, but Tamil Nadu Social Welfare Department has certain work profiles where the requisite qualification is a degree in women's studies. And that is a very useful thing for us to push for in other states as well. Corporates now are increasingly looking at people with a women's studies degree because we seem to know quite a bit of the social sciences with the added advantage of the women focus and the gender focus. So if sky is the limit, try for UN, because UN needs a lot of people to advise them to engage in all their projects which require a women and a gender-centric focus. So this is for the students and scholars here, but for the faculty colleagues there, which also means that we need to put forward a cognitive pedagogy when we offer a course in women's studies, because the students who come to us as a bachelor's in a particular discipline, and now we have to quickly take them through those 2 years across disciplines so that they can meaningfully engage with those disciplines. But on that note, if I have to go back to the topic, how do we understand the what, how, and why of women's studies? The best way to do it is engage with women's studies, join women's studies, talk to the community of scholars. You would automatically figure out the nitty-gritties. On that note, thanks so much for the opportunity, and best wishes to the students, scholars who have trusted women's studies and come to our fold, and also the faculty out there who have been doing yeoman service to a discipline which somehow demands that we keep justifying our presence as time and again. So kudos to all of you, and thanks for the opportunity. Thank you.
So thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for the detailed and informative lecture. And we are open for the questions and discussions now. So if there is any question, please put it in the chat box and I'll read it, or you can just raise it by yourself. I guess, ma'am, we have one question.
So, yeah,
It is from
I
Dr.
just say a
Yeah.
few word of, sorry, Hiba.
Yes, ma'am.
I just take a few minutes with Professor Bharati.
Okay,
So,
ma'am.
Professor Bharati, thank you very much for being here and sharing such a thought-provoking inputs on the topic. It was very much needed because there has been a lot of confusion on the very. In fact, I also could not join fully, but I could listen from where you have exactly touched on the issues of perceptions and perspectives. And I fully agree with you that whatever the individual perceptions are being shared and get built over and became perspectives, and it has really throwing an important issue to the students, and we have to think over that. And of course, you did touch upon the prospects of women's studies and how the government departments are also now turning inclusive. So we have to lobby for, and as Madam rightly pointed out, that is a very objective of this forum. And I have been asking this core committee to prepare a memorandum and submit this time, the election time, particularly I'm talking about Tamil Nadu, and it can be done to other states also. So there are political parties which are collecting the petitions. So this should go, or even to the ruling community, party, you can submit and get this thing even before the election. So this is the right time that you all act swiftly, particularly Tamil Nadu women study scholars who are all present here and are not able to join, but will be there in the group, and the core group has to take a swift action, and we will be there to guide you to prepare that memorandum. And it has to go in Tamil to the Tamil Nadu government chief minister to take a decision. So please make use of the time. And Professor Bharati is there in Madras University, and she will definitely be of help to get these things done, whether it is editing the letter or arranging to also, we will join with you when you go. I take this opportunity to thank Professor Bharathi for being here and definitely opening the issues which have not been dealt during these 10 weeks or so. And there are more participants also this week, and that is because of the topic you have suggested. Thank you very much. Now it is open for discussion.
Thanks so much, Professor Manimekle.
Yeah, ma'am. So there was this question from Dr. R.K. Maya from Itharaj College for Women, Chennai. And the question is, can we say that gender studies is more important than women studies?
Okay. Dr. Maya, you caught me there. I was kind of quite carefully avoiding that slippery slope. Uh, see, the issues are two ways. Okay. When we look at it as gender studies, we are able to bring into the fold the other genders as well. And so more vulnerabilities, more disadvantages are uh, looked upon and examined. However, what happens is we cannot say, let us subsume women's studies in gender studies, because I think for at least for some more time to come, these two have to go parallel. Okay, so it's not a question of one being more important than the other. It's a question of we have to engage with both of them simultaneously, because very often we end up uh, putting in historical terms, oh, this is the past and this is done. So we cannot say that regarding women, because women's issues are not yet over. So given that reality, women's studies needs to be there. While I will agree with you that gender may be a larger framework to look upon and study our society. But having said that, I will not say women's studies or gender studies, but I will always put it as women and gender studies, because I feel both of them have to travel together for some more time to come.
Yeah, thank you very much, ma'am, for the answer. We have another question from Shivani, and she asked why being a feminist has a negative connotation.
I'm not saying being a feminist has a negative connotation, but I said the label of one being a feminist is often provided with a ranker. The way people would want to describe themselves, they will say, I'm a feminist, but, and they want to give some qualifiers on what aspect of feminism they follow. So it is that I was questioning. So somewhere along, see, we need to be very clear that what our activists are doing and what our level workers are doing, certainly we are not engaging with the field as and within an academic situation. Of course, we have our projects and we have our research, but what I mean is the day-to-day life that they are interacting with, lives of women that they are interacting with, we do not have. We are not doing it. So in fact, one of my pet grouses in women's studies is we keep following the global women's studies theories and examples for our classroom purposes. Whereas there is a lot of data, there is a lot of case studies, theories available right in front of us, around us. But only thing is somewhere we have not engaged with each other. And that is where I feel we cannot again put an either or there. So we need to look at feminism within the purview. So we also need to look at women's studies within the purview of feminism. So they are mutually together. They are inclusive and not exclusive. I think someone has raised
Yes,
Dr.
ma'am.
Bala Ramaswamy. Maybe you should ask her to speak.
Uh, yes,
Yes, ma'am.
hello.
Yeah.
So, ma'am, there's this another question. It is about uh, intersectionality in women's studies. What are the recent trends in Indian feminist discourse regarding the fields such as Dalit feminist studies? It is from Utkarsh.
Okay. Thanks for that question, first of all. Because the minute we say intersectionality, we are looking at different social markers engaging probably differently with women's studies. And what is remarkable is several specific social markers can also interact with women's studies. So when we talk about Dalit feminism, for instance, again the paralleling. See, whatever the other forms of feminism in the Indian context has normalized is getting questioned in Dalit feminism, which is a healthy trend. Because we always believe the enemy is outside. We can also have a lot of problem makers within. So that is where I feel that the intersectional discourses today are engaging in two different trajectories. One, it is asking us to look at more and more vulnerabilities and more subtleties in the social markers. So that certainly is the discourse that I am seeing today in among the feminists. The other aspect is it is also giving us a kind of a handle to find out if where we have gone wrong. At one level, we say feminist discourses. All feminist discourses are not answering or asking the questions that need to be asked or answered. So, given that, if you look at, say, Dalit feminism to even eco-feminist movements in India, then we can actually corroborate the two and find out that there is some questions that Dalit feminism is raising that has not yet been considered in ecofeminism or any other feminism. So here is where we are having a lot of talking back and talking to within women's studies. And I see it as a healthy trend.
Hello. Yes, ma'am. I think you have
I
cleared.
think Dr. Bala Ramaswamy has been raising her
Ramaswamy.
hand. Maybe she should
Yes,
speak.
Hello.
ma'am.
Yeah. So can you please ask her to unmute and speak? Ma'am, you can unmute
Uh,
and speak, please.
Yeah, may I?
Yes, ma'am, please.
Thank you. Uh, just I would like to know how to make some men understand that feminism does not mean anti-men.
Okay. Thanks so much for that question, ma'am. We have been engaging with it for very long, but I don't know how much of success we can claim for it. The point also, which I have noticed, is this perception that feminism means anti-men is only what we are looking at as a perception that has transformed into a long-lasting perspective now. So it only started as a perception among a few, but it
Mhm.
is, it has become now crystallized, and we feel that the minute we use the feminist as a word, we are anti-men. And one of the things that is being done in many of the centers, as I know, is a lot of gender sensitization workshops are being conducted. And happy to also state that several men and women take part in it. So we do hope that if we reach enough of the population with the gender sensitization and awareness programs, we should be able to do it probably in a generational span. But as of now, there is still a big question mark looms large the minute you use the term feminist.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes.
Are there any more questions?
No, ma'am, I don't think we do have any other question. Okay, so indeed, it was a great privilege to listen to your lecture and the discussion which we had. So with a positive note, I would like to thank you, ma'am. And as a student and on the behalf of every student, I would like to thank you for giving such a wonderful and detailed lecture. So I think we'll be ending the meeting now.
Thank you. Thanks so much
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you very
to
much.
all of you
ma'am.
Thank
who
you.
raised the questions.
Thank you,
And
Professor
to-
Bharathi.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Bharathi.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
I'm Nandini.
Yes, I noticed, ma'am.
Nandini, is my
Yes,
mother.
super colleague of
Hi.
ours from the Indian
Balambal.
History Department now. So, also
Hi.
that.
Thank you,
you.
Rajana Harishya. Thank you.
So nice. She told me
Thank
about
you.
it.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you. And also thanks to the organizers. Thank you
Mhm.
all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.